All right, in our next set of discussions around institutions, we're looking at the family. So in this module, we're going to revisit the question of social institutions, think about what goes into a family. In this video, we'll look at some trends around marriage and divorce and think about what makes a family a family. And then in later videos, we'll look at issues around domestic violence, the domestic division of labor, who does domestic work, and issues with young motherhood. So, what is a family? Well, first off, a family is a social institution, so let's revisit that definition. A social institution is a set of organized roles and social positions, and these are organized to meet a particular general social need. This general definition seems very abstract, but when we start thinking about what a family does, this kind of makes the idea of an institution much clearer. That it is a social unit that's really centralized around the socialization and raising of children in particular, at least in the sociological definition. Now, many of you may have what we call families of orientation, where we were raised, and we have what are maybe outdatedly called families of procreation, which are the families we create. And you may have families that are not centered around raising children, but for the sociological definition, we really focus on the unit that unites individuals around bearing and raising of children. When we think in terms of technical definition, the census counts a family unit as a household with children under the age of 18. That is, children who are not yet adults. So this is a set of organized social positions around raising and socializing children. So what does that mean? The thing about social institutions is that they don't really change a lot. The roles and positions within a social institution tend to remain the same over time, and people tend to get kind of worried or alarmed if they change. So if we think about a family, um, if I asked you to draw a picture of a family right now, you might draw two parents and a child, one parent and a child, a parent, a child, and a dog. Occasionally people actually throw a cat in there, even though we all know cats aren't really part of the family. They're outsiders. We can think of different kinds of families in our society. We talk about the nuclear family. This comes from nucleus, as in like a cell has a nucleus that's at its core. Um, this is the typical idea of the family in the US. This is perhaps the idea of what a quote-unquote normal family is. Two parents, children, and siblings. Um, However, is that what a normal family looks like? Many communities of color in Latinx and Black communities tend to live with extended families. This is where people outside of the core family unit of parents and children are involved in everyday family life. So grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. What is a normal family in the US? Really, since the 1960s, two-parent households have been on the decline. They're still the majority, 60%, but increasingly we see the rise of single-parent households, up from 9% to 26%. So that's a quarter of all households in this country. Um, Increasingly, we see what we call two-income households. Um, so in 1970, it was kind of classic leave it to beaver idea of the family was predominant. The mother didn't work. The dad worked full time. Um, and today we see a much larger percent, almost 50% of households, both parents work full time, both mother and father. And this is, of course, in heterosexual households. Um, this is important. We often think that perhaps this makes the family more stable. But if we look at those households in the middle where the mother works part-time, if the father lost his job in 19, let's say, 75, that meant the mother could go pick up a job, help contribute to the household, and increased stability over time. Today, when we have two-income households, that means if one partner loses their job, um, often both of those incomes are needed for the household to thrive. So this actually creates greater instability in society, and we're seeing this more and more in the times of a pandemic, in which the fragility of households is becoming much more apparent as parents lose work. We also see changes um, here in the third slide and the diversity of types of parental households. We see uh, interesting stability in the parents in remarriage, about 14% in 1960, and about 15% today. But we see a clear rise in cohabitation. This means that the parents are not married but live together. A clear rise in single parent households. And a decline from 75%, about 73%, of two parent households. What could account for this? If we look at the decline in two parent households, often this is what those who are trying to defend the family get up in arms around. One clear trend we see is a rise in divorce rates. In 1960, it goes way, way up in 1970, but actually after about 1975, it stabilizes and really starts to decline. What can account for this trend? Why this big jump? Why the decline? It's actually a pretty complex picture. For one thing, if we think about the post-war era and this time period in general, this is when women were first really allowed to enter the workforce. If we go back to the 1950s, that Leave It to Beaver household, maybe some people think of it as idyllic, but there's a great deal of domestic abuse. Many women weren't really that into the marriage. The drug Ritalin, for example, it's an ADD drug that was developed because a husband who's a scientist found his wife just wasn't committed to her housework, and she needed something to help her focus on it. So he developed Ritalin, which is essentially speed or an amphetamine. What happened in the 1970s is that more and more women started entering the workforce and were able to support themselves. And so a lot of women, GTFO, as the kids say, they got out of their marriages because they were now able to support themselves. We also see changing ideas around women in the workplace. It was considered, for middle-class people, problematic for women to work. But today, we see it as pretty normal, and part of that happens because of the women's rights movement. So when we look at this picture, it's a pretty complex set of things that we can look at that lead to this growth and then steady decline. Less women are entering marriages they don't want to. More women can support themselves. It's okay for women to support themselves. It's not seen as wrong or problematic. And women now have access to the workplace. So rights, economics, all of these point to the complex picture of marriage and divorce we see today. The number of single, never married women has gone up. And the slight dip we see in the number of married women right there at 1970 has, as a percentage of all women in the workforce, has increased. So more women working, more freedom to work, and society saying, yeah, it's okay that women should work. All right, in the next video, we're going to get into some of the issues around cohabitation, and we're going to think about the ways in which family life plays into life in a quarantine in our flip grid this week.